My guest today is Michael Johnson, the CEO of Metrc. He is responsible for leading the team in supporting the safety and security of the nation's legal cannabis market. Michael spent his career scaling hyper-growth tech businesses, working with investors, and overseeing financial operations. Prior to Metrc, he served as a CFO of Informed DNA, the largest provider of genetic services, where he led the company to consecutive years of high growth, eventually selling the company to private equity investors. Prior to Informed DNA, Johnson served as a CFO of CM Group, a family of global marketing technology brands, where he drove cost efficiencies and increased margins through corporate acquisitions, financing, and restructuring. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Well, how did that background lead you into cannabis?
It's a funny, kind of a weird story. Certainly not any historical relationship to what has become now one of the fastest growing and most meaningful cash crops in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really more of a matter of chance, as sometimes the best opportunities seem to appear from in that serendipitous fashion. So I live in Tampa, Florida. Metrc is based in Lakeland, Florida, which is kind of halfway between Tampa and Orlando. And we had successfully exited my previous company, Informed DNA, and came across the founder of Metrc, or the parent company of at that time, what Metrc was a part of, and was just truly fascinated at where this kind of technology and opportunity for emergent growth in the space was leading. Definitely became an area where I spent more time, I think, focused on kind of ideating than I did sort of in the last little bit of my time at Informed DNA, and ultimately made sense to join in a full-time capacity as president and CFO initially, and then ultimately about a year later becoming CEO. The founder of Metrc, who's no longer part of the ownership group, but was really part of building this over 30 years, and a lot of other businesses, ancillary and certainly precursors to what Metrc has turned into. Phenomenal leader, phenomenal technology mind, but by his own admission, he's not an operator. And so as Metrc grew, it certainly needed more operational rigor, and that's where I came in, and it's been a great ride ever since.
All right, well, congratulations. And we'll get into the New York and Metrc story now. So New York's Office of Cannabis Management originally selected BioTrack as its track and trace vendor, with a rollout originally scheduled for sometime around August of 2025. In fact, the second episode of last year, of this podcast last year, was with Dr. Mo Afena, who's BioTrack's chief operating officer. Operators had already begun integration when Metrc and BioTrack reached an agreement whereby Metrc assumed BioTrack's government contracts. How did that acquisition come about, and what was the transition like internally?
Yeah, it came about, I think, was a longer time coming. And so unfortunately in the cannabis space, whether you're an operator in the plant touching side or providing ancillary services, certainly like we do on the technology side, it's a tough road. It's hard for a lot of companies to kind of fight through that green rush. I mean, there's over, I think, 70 different point of sale vendors at this point for less than 10,000 dispensaries across the country. That's not a very big slice for any one participant. And so in this space, in the track and trace space, we had competed, but we also aligned a bit with BioTrack from a relationship perspective. And I've known Mo since I've been in this role. Mo is an exceptional leader, really good human being. And so we definitely started to have deeper conversations, and ultimately their business model was a little bit different than our business model. And I think it made it a little bit more challenging for them to continue to focus heavily on the track and trace side when their real growth opportunities were more in the B2B space. And so as you get kind of further out into the horizon, trying to evaluate what the future prospects look like for really any business, sometimes you reach a crossroads. And so in this situation, we felt like we could support a kind of a breakaway of the government part of BioTrack into a separate standalone entity in an area that Mo could continue to lead, and move towards something that we felt ultimately would be better overall, better for the market, better for the existing BioTrack customers. In the implementation in New York, I think there were some challenges and still some hiccups that needed to be resolved, and certainly we've experienced that in the implementation. And some of the barriers that need to be overcome are areas that Metrc had a little bit more experience with. And ultimately, we let the state know that this was a bit of a change in structure. They haven't fully implemented. While certainly some people did start the integration, there was very little, relatively speaking, that was actually completed. And it seemed to make a lot of sense at that time for them to be able to see a quicker path to getting to where ultimately the state needed to be from their regulatory regime. And we were fortunately able to mobilize some resources and do a record implementation. And we're still sort of experiencing that. It takes a little bit of time before kind of this normalcy sets in, but we're certainly getting quite a bit closer. New York has set records so far year to date in terms of retail revenue, far beyond the projections that they set even middle of last year.
All right, so for listeners who are maybe new to this space who didn't hear Dr. Mo last year, can you walk us through, at its core, what does Metrc do? What problems does seed to sale tracking solve?
Yeah, Metric is really a data layer more than anything else. And so this gives visibility to the standard way of moving products through the supply chain. And so it's called seed to sale for the cannabis space, but many industries have track and trace, even industries that maybe don't seem as obvious, like the oyster industry, where every pack or like bushel of oysters is tracked individually, or cattle. So every cow in the United States required to have an RFID tag attached to its ear, so you can track cattle through the process, ultimately through however consumers will consume products derived from beef. And track and trace for cannabis is really no different in that sense. So you're essentially creating a technological ecosystem that allows for the collection and sort of the registration of data for cannabis product across the supply chain. So that means that every cannabis plant is registered within the system using standard identification mechanisms, the activities that would occur within that plant. So whether or not you're adding pesticides, or you are ultimately potentially killing that plant dies, and then all the way through to harvest, you're tracking within the system. But you're not tracking anything that you shouldn't already be tracking just in a typical ERP, or really anything that will be tracked in any other agricultural regime. Like, you still have crop planning. It's very similar. In fact, it's actually a little bit more lightweight than that. Ultimately, when a product is harvested, it's packaged, and those packages then via transportation and certainly aligned with the regulations will move to processors. Sometimes that cannabis flower is harvested or is processed, I apologize, into pre-rolls, into containers of raw flower. Sometimes it is distilled into oil, which is what ultimately becomes things like gummies and vapes.
Mm-hmm.
In New York, there's a requirement to go through a distributor before product is ultimately received at a dispensary and sold to an end consumer. And so the transfer of that product to the distributor is certainly tracked within our system, and ultimately the end sale. And so again, it's a reporting mechanism to capture the data in a standardized format so that there is full visibility and traceability across the supply chain, that enables everybody to play off the same rules, read off the same sheet of music, and ultimately protect public health from a product that has not gone through the appropriate testing, machinations, and has not been through the regulated supply chain, which frequently is a risk to any consumer.
Well, can you walk us through how the system functions day to day? So for a cultivator who has to tag individual plants, all the way through the retailer that has to reconcile sales records.
Absolutely, yes. So when a cannabis cultivator wants to put plants in the ground, and let's just start at the time when a plant reaches a level of what we would call a vegetative state. Every plant is identified with a unique identifier. That unique identifier is something that we provide. Has functionality to where it could be read wirelessly using RFID technology, which is the standard for agriculture and supply chains. It's just about every meaningful supply chain in the world leverages wireless traceability or wireless readability of the product, including the largest retailer in the world, which is Walmart. And so a tag which is about 3.5 inches wide, about 1.5 inches in depth there, will be attached to a plant. When it's attached to a plant, that plant is then able to be registered within the system. The operator will register in the system whatever it is that is relevant to that plant. Sometimes they will include information that's optional, like the strain name. Sometimes they include other things like that are not optional, like the date it was planted. But these are all things that you would normally track in any system. And then from there, over time, the plant will usually, if it's an indoor growth scenario, because that's a little bit more standard, so we'll use that as the best example. Usually it takes about 90 days before a plant reaches harvest, give or take. In that timeline, sometimes the plant is trimmed. Sometimes there's something called a manicure harvest, which is like a beginning or like a smaller harvest. Anything you're doing to the plant that changes the structure, would cause a material difference in the plant, is generally tracked and entered within the system. And again, this would be entered into an ERP or anything else if Metrc weren't in existence. Ultimately, that plant is harvested. Most plants, if listeners aren't familiar, most plants will be kind of cut from the base, harvested, usually weighed, and that's really important both operationally and from a regulatory perspective. But you want to have a sense of how much a plant weighs. You're going to then allow that plant to cure. Some people are spending a few weeks in cure. Sometimes it's different, shorter, longer, what have you. There's a lot of moisture loss that occurs in the cure phase. That plant is actually moved to a different room. Usually it's dark, fairly humid. And that moisture loss is trying to regulate that so you don't lose so much, or you don't in a way that you don't intend to. About 80% is generally lost in the cure phase. You'll then weigh that plant, track that as well. Again, like as an operator, you're going to be very mindful of how much moisture loss. And then from there, that plant, the flower on that plant is harvested. There's sometimes, the different stems and branches and things like that are retained as well. Sometimes they're wasted. It really depends on how that operator works. So all of this information is tracked within the system. It can be input within the system manually within Metrc. It can be done wirelessly using a third-party provider that's leveraging RFID. So weighing happens instantaneously and is recorded in the system instantaneously. And it could be, in many situations, imported into Metrc via an integration with another third-party ERP system.
And that's still at the cultivator side.
Still at the cultivator side, absolutely. And it's just their normal way of doing business. So you're capturing the details mostly associated with anything where there could be some sort of misalignment or some sort of movement in and out of the supply chain. That's really a primary area where if somebody were wanting to color outside the lines, they would look to, and we certainly have seen that happen.
Yeah, and then it goes to the processor.
And then it goes to the processor. So product will get transferred. In New York, like many states, you have to use a licensed transportation service to move the product. One of the more critical parts of Metrc, one of the areas that's been most effective at maintaining the integrity of the supply chain, is the handoff. And usually, just like anything in life, things get lost in the seams. And so the handoff is what we refer to as transfer. Within Metrc, there's something called a transfer manifest. So you have legal custody of this controlled substance as the grower. You are then going to enter into a plan, essentially, just like you would send in most industries, like a purchase order, to another party that you are going to transfer a certain amount of cannabis, a certain time, certain amount, so on and so forth. And you're going to use a specific transporter. That has to happen within Metrc by somebody that's licensed to be able to make that transfer and actually affect that movement in the chain of custody. A transporter that's been identified will accept it and then ultimately will deliver it to the final destination, where within Metrc, an actual login by a licensed operator will have to occur to formally accept that, so that there's not a gap or a break along the way in transportation. We've all seen the heist movies. Usually it happens when product is in flight. When you get to the processor, a number of things could occur. So a processor that is taking the loose cannabis flower and breaking that down, grinding that down for pre-rolls, because pre-rolls tend to be very granular. Cannabis has to be very granular to work within the pre-roll. Most operators will have, or most producers will have, very large pre-roll machines, and so they'll grind down the cannabis, flower. They will create their pre-rolls. The pre-rolls will then come out. They'll be packaged, sometimes in the final form. Sometimes there's some additional steps along the way. But the conversion in Metrc is really a little bit more simple in that sense, because you, as an operator, you received a certain amount of flower. So if you receive 10 pounds of flower, basically you're producing 10 pounds of product, whether it's 10 pounds of equivalent of pre-rolls, 10 pounds of equivalent of that flour that's been packaged into 8 baggies or jars. It usually matches fairly well. Sometimes there's some loss in there, and that would be recorded within the system, just like it would be recorded in any other industry. Again, this can be input directly into Metrc. It can be input via a third-party system through the integration. It really is fairly flexible in terms of how that data gets into Metrc.
And then it goes to the distributor,
Correct.
and then eventually it finds its way into your neighborhood dispensary.
It's correct. Yes.
So what happens at the dispensary?
Well, at the dispensary, a product will get taken in. That product has, when it's in its final form, it generally has been tested. So New York requires product to be tested in its final form, which is a little bit different than some other states. It's somewhat similar to how California and Florida work, but most other states work a different way. And so final form testing means that product that is, let's say it's a vape, that product is tested after it's already been in the vape capsule or the pod. Really important, candidly, and I think it's a noteworthy thing for the citizens of the state of New York to understand that there are risks associated with the material that the pod is created from. Sometimes it's a plastic, a carbon of some kind, a rubber, and that can leach into, especially when heated at a high temperature, leach into the vape oil, and then you would ingest that, and that's obviously not great. So final form testing will occur before the product gets to distribution. You'll also have an identifier on the product that allows for traceability of that individual product, such that the consumer has the ability to scan that product and see what the associated detailed lab test is, see a picture of the product. So if I'm picking up a purple bag and the picture I'm looking at is a green jar, maybe something's been tampered with here. Maybe there's kind of an issue. Also will demonstrate what, what I should expect, general product information. So that product will ultimately make it from distribution to the retailer, and the retailer will intake that product and will be able to ultimately sell to a consumer. In New York, all products are kept kind of behind the counter, although sometimes there's displays of the product in like empty or sample sort of packaging. And that product will ultimately be scanned as sold using that QR code that demonstrates within the system that that supply chain has been completed for that particular product. It allows for consumers to then be able to look, as I mentioned, scan and see the COA, but also ensure that they've gotten something and they're consuming something that is safe, properly tested, and gives them better peace of mind as they're experiencing something.
Thank you. I think it's important for people to understand that seed to sale journey and all the things that go on behind the scenes there. Now, when Metrc stepped into New York, as we discussed earlier, the market was already alive. So what were the biggest operational and logistical challenges that you faced sort of stepping into this role and replacing another vendor?
I think it's really twofold. Replacing the other vendor isn't really as tricky because BioTrack wasn't live at the time and ultimately would have had further delays in terms of the implementation. And that's a function of a variety of different things, not necessarily BioTrack. So replacing that vendor wasn't tricky because it really wasn't fully rolled out. What is hard, and we've had experiences like this in other states, is entering a market where the market has been able to mature a bit without the track and trace ecosystem. And so there are just a huge variety of different methods for which people have started to build out their processes, whether it's from a cultivation process or even a retailer. And everybody's doing things a little bit different.
And that's because the track and trace responsibility was still there even without the vendor being there.
It was, but even if it wasn't, people in disparate businesses that don't know each other, if they're creating these SOPs and workflows, they're going to come up with what works best at that time. No one went to college to learn how to build out a cannabis farm. This is a fairly new thing. and so certainly made tremendous strides. But generally speaking, the participants in the space couldn't have more than a decade or so of experience, which is really small in the
Mhm.
general in the long-term horizon. We've been building cars for over 100 years. It evolved very differently, and so it is remarkable. It is fairly special to see how mature the cannabis operations have been able to get in a fairly short period of time. But the reality remains that you've got a lot of operators that are still learning this and doing this for the first time. So whether there was a requirement to report previously or not, you're still going to have operators that are figuring out the best way from their perspective to be able to structure their business. Without standards and consistency, you end up in scenarios where products aren't tested uh, in the right place in the supply chain, maybe aren't properly tested at all. You also have meaningful risk of inversion and diversion, and that creates a really big problem, especially when it comes to public health, and certainly when it comes to these different businesses that are buying to create really successful enterprises, playing off a level and fair playing field.
Yeah, no, I myself saw growers that, were very sophisticated and had software that they were using. And I remember one particular grower who was using a notebook and was sort of just flipping pages as we talked about his
We still
process.
see a lot of that. In fact, across Metric wide and between Metric and now the partnership here with BC Gov, we represent 39 different states and territories. Over 60% of cultivations and processors still leverage Metric as their primary system of record. And that's not really what it was designed for.
Mhm.
There's tremendous partners out there that are different ERP solutions that can add a lot of value. We've certainly tried to do what we can as we evolve the system to be able to meet some of those operator requirements and requests. But it's still a very wide array of approaches that different operators will take. And I see pen and paper in every cultivation I go to.
Mhm.
And it's definitely going to continue to emerge more technologically. But again, most people that are in this space, they've never done anything like this before.
Right. So the Cannabis Association of New York has taken issue with a 10-cent per unit retail ID tag fee. And then some micro business operators have argued that Metric's structure forced them to tag products multiple times, driving compliance costs from 10 cents to over 40 cents per unit. How does Metric respond to those concerns? Is there any flexibility built into the fee model? And then why are individual tags on items necessary rather than just batch tags used in other jurisdictions? I mean, you started off, you mentioned the oyster batches, right? So that's akin to having a tag for each oyster as opposed to the batch of oysters.
It is, but it's not the same level of regulation. So I think there's a lot of what I would describe as myths and misinformation that are working throughout the cannabis space in New York right now. So to be very clear, Metric adopted the existing contract with BioTrack.
Mhm.
So it's not a metric thing. There is a position that BioTrack would have done it differently, and I'm quite certain it wouldn't have. We did a lot of work on this,
Mhm.
but nevertheless, it still is the impression at this point in time. The contract very clearly says that the fee for track and trace is 10 cents per digital UID. Digital UID. So that's not a physical tag, it's not a physical QR code, it's none of those things. In Metric, a UID is many things. It is in every state, it's an individual item, and this is just a normal ERP structure. So, and
So
the
it's
easiest
not
way,
unique to New York, which is another.
no, this is just a different pricing model that we adopted. We didn't originate, we adopted. But nevertheless, like the pricing actually, what gets lost in this is pricing compared to other states is meaningfully lower in New York. It's priced differently. So to say this differently, we make meaningfully more money on a per item basis through the supply chain in just about every other state.
Mm.
And so it's a difference because it's a change, and it is a change that ultimately wasn't expected for many operators. And I can appreciate that.
Mhm.
I have empathy for that. I don't I I'm a CPA. I don't like I don't
surprises.
like to pay more than I would need to. Very close at tracking dollars and cents, and I can certainly appreciate that. The digital identifier is not associated with retail ID. Retail ID actually saves the operators meaningful amount of money. And so the only reason that that retail ID became attractive for the regulators from their perspective is for the benefit of the operators. So the way the regulations are written, and I believe it's a statute, product has to be labeled in its final form at production. You're required to have the associated package for which that individual item is labeled on that individual item. It's called a UID. This is very similar to just about every other state where cannabis is allowed. Difference is that in most other states, that label and other labels sometimes can be applied at the dispensary. This is important because the individual item could get repackaged at distribution. A dispensary could want to transfer it to another dispensary that still has to go through a distro in New York. But it requires relabeling. It's also very manual at production to relabel 24 items that go in a case with one number, and then the next 24 with another number, and the next 24 with another number. This is a manual process. So the the different conversations that perhaps you've had and perhaps some of the listeners have had about this process and having to affix a physical sticker is again not a retail ID thing. This is something that would occur regardless of whether Metrc was in place or BioTrack or anybody else, because that's specific to what is required by the state. Retail ID, the functionality makes this much, much easier because you're, instead of printing 24 stickers for a product that goes in a case and then 24 more stickers and 24 more stickers, it doesn't matter what order and which individual item you put a QR code on. If you have 1,000 items that go into 20 different boxes, it doesn't matter which one. Now, if you want to keep track of it, you can scan a production and and keep track of any individual one that you'd like. That's certainly not an issue and not a restriction in the space. But it saves you so much time. It also enables you, instead of having to print out a sticker or stop your actual supply chain, it enables you to print these on a line, on an assembly line, or on your individual package instead of actually having a sticker. And then they get associated. Further, the producer then gets to actually see what's happening in the supply chain and gets access to that sell-through data, which is not something that is available for other states, which is pretty meaningful. And then ultimately that the consumer ends up getting really great visibility into the lab test and more information associated with the product, which ultimately creates better brand loyalty and gives better visibility to the individual item. But this notion that you're paying 10 cents, like nowhere, I don't really know how this has gained so much steam. Nowhere in Metrc does it demonstrate you're paying 10 cents for a retail ID. Nowhere, anywhere. The contract is public record.
I mean, as you may be aware, this has caused such a stir in the state that the legislature is now involved, and actually, there's a bill that's been introduced to be able to fund this cost. I assume put money into OCM to have the state pick up this cost as opposed to the individual operators.
And that happens in a number of states. I mean, there's states where the cost of compliance or the cost for the regulatory system will be passed to the consumer of that. Same reason why you pay for a hunting license or a fishing license. The software that facilitates that, they get paid on an individual license basis. That's directly from the consumer. Same scenario with the driver's license, and same scenario with with registration for your car. Same scenario when you park on the street. So Park Mobile, if you're paying an app, park on the street in your city, they get paid directly from you as the consumer. So it's the more common model in the government space. Whatever the state of New York chooses to do, we're indifferent. We're completely agnostic. It doesn't really matter whether or not it's an individual that's paying us directly or the state pays us directly.
Now, the legislative members involved didn't seem to have an idea of what the cost would be. I assume you have an idea of what the cost should be.
We have some idea, but it's been very inconsistent, to be honest. So we only have data going back 2 months, and so we had a big jump initially, and now it's really tapered off quite a bit. in terms of production. So it's hard to say without track and trace in the past. It's really difficult to be able to get to that number. I will say that the average item in New York sells, and it fluctuates, but sells close to $40 per item. The 10-cent fee, if you're going to calculate on a per item basis, is something that I think helps to give visibility into how that looks. And certainly we can mimic what happens in other states, like multiple states like Oregon, for example. Every single bottle of wine that's produced for the state of Oregon has an identifier on it that costs 25 cents. And so there are different analogs that we can reach to help support calculation from the legislator. Whatever anybody wants, we're here for it. We're very excited to be a partner with the state of New York and with the ecosystem within New York, and I'm fairly certain that we can find a way to continue to do this in a way that matches what the legislator will be interested in.
All right, and we'll shift track a little bit. Now, one of the core promises of seed to sale is shutting out unlicensed product. How effective, realistically, can Metrc be at reducing illicit cannabis from entering the New York market?
Yeah, Metrc can be very effective as a mitigation. We're certainly not investigators, so the data suggests that something's happening at a licensed operator that maybe shouldn't be happening. We're not putting on, the vests and heading to knock on doors. We're the data provider, and the state certainly would perform an investigation.
Mhm.
But imagine the number of licensees, the number of investigators being just knocking on doors every day. That would be a very time-consuming process. And we provide the data. The data allows for the investigators to determine what they think the biggest risk is in the supply chain and what they want to do in terms of performing their compliance inspections. It's helpful, but it is a tool similar to the systems that would at an airport, if you were putting your bag through that conveyor.
Mhm.
If the X-ray machine sees something shaped like a gun, telling the inspector to open that bag and take a look. And that's really where we're at with what we're providing. We're definitely giving the data points that are derived and determined by what the state decides is anomalous.
Well,
And
can you give us an example of what a data point would be that would give rise to further investigation?
absolutely, but I can give you an example of what we've seen in other states. I don't have visibility, and generally speaking, we don't get directed on terms of the definitions of in every situation of an area where an ongoing investigation may occur. But anomalous scenarios frequently are too much waste in the cultivation, excessive moisture loss, products that have been in harvest or harvested after 60 days, which sometimes can happen, but usually the harvest on a per plant basis is meaningfully lower. So if you have a grow that goes 30 days and produces 200 grams per plant, that's odd. That doesn't usually happen. Usually plants aren't even flowering that quickly, but even if they were, they're not producing the same amount that you would expect to happen after 90 days. So too much waste, product that sits in one place for too long, breakdown of the relationships across transfer. So if I have 100 pounds of flour, I should be able to produce enough pre-rolls that represent, so 1 gram pre-roll, I should be able to produce, I'll do the math in my head, like 44,000 of them, something like that. So if I don't, that's a problem. If I have
But
100
but
grams
that
of
sounds to me more like a diversion issue as opposed to an inversion issue.
No. So the first example, so if you process in inversion example specific to harvesting product within 30 days. So usually there's something called auto flower, which usually gets harvested within like 60 days,
Mhm.
but they're smaller. So you're sub 100 grams per plant. If you're processing or you're harvesting after 60 days at 200 grams per plant, that suggests that you brought in or
Mm.
potentially could have, for investigation, product from another source and blended it with what was actually produced from what you would typically see. And again, 60 days, autoflower, not generally more than 100 grams per plant. Certainly some exceptions, but not generally more than 100 grams per plant. So if I'm reporting 200 grams, that suggests it came from somewhere else.
Got it. How many jurisdictions is Metrc operating in currently?
Between Metric and BT Gov, I believe we're in 39 right now, from states and territories and tribal nations.
So what are the top two or three lessons that you learned from those jurisdictions that, enabled you to get started and ramp up in New York?
I would say like our mantra as a business is required to desired. So metric for many is required. There's certainly lots that would pick metric whether they're required to or not, and we get those calls. But for the most part, you're pushing on a timeline. You're required to use a system via regulatory body. The goal is not to make you feel like you're required to use the system. It's to make you feel like you're having a good experience from using that system, that you are able to leverage participation with that system in a growing industry where consumers feel really strong protection and safety in the product and really allowing for those to grow their business. So required to desired is a core mantra on how we do things. Before I joined Metrc, I think we were really focused solely on the regulator as our only customer. And to be very clear, like our contracts are with state governments, generally speaking, and there is a meaningful relationship there, and we value that relationship, and we certainly honor that relationship. Just because the contract is with the state doesn't mean that the operator that's working in Metrc, and there's over 500,000 operators working in Metrc at in any given month, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't also be treated that same way. And so it used to be not the best customer experience in terms of interacting with our support team or performance within the system. We've made meaningful strides, and anybody that might be listening or watching that's experienced Metrc, call it 3 years ago, I'm sure can attest to the meaningful strides. That doesn't mean that we're done. We're not, celebrating. We haven't, kind of put the keyboards down. But it gives us, I think, a much better foundation to be able to continue to iterate and build better relationships, better functionality, and ultimately support the most rigorous and strong supply chain to protect public health. Really, the integrity of the supply chain is the core part. Communication is a touchstone to that. I think some of the challenges in New York that we've experienced have been a a lot of disconnect and miscommunication, certainly at a level that we've not regularly seen. And so it is a combination of several things. Certainly one of them, as you mentioned, is a different financial or different commercial model, which I certainly get. I lived in Binghamton and Rochester. My wife is from outside of Poughkeepsie. We spent a lot of time in New York. We continue to spend a lot of time in New York. Although living in Florida, I think I might be surrounded by more New Yorkers now.
Absolutely.
It's a state that's beautiful and complex and completely different. It's really four states in one. And so we communicate with some operators in one part of the state, and they don't always talk to operators in another part of the state. And they're doing things very differently, and they're kind of working within their flows and their suppliers. And it's just different, candidly. It's just different. And so I think that we certainly could have done a lot better in terms of communication in some areas. I think we've definitely learned a lot of lessons. Unfortunately, when you do something this quick, you're going to be in a spot to where communication gaps can occur. And that's definitely something that I look to us to take very seriously to improve upon and become the best communicators in the space for the operators in the state of New York.
So, what is the current status of New York's rollout? And then looking ahead 3 to 5 years, what role does Metrc play in the maturation of the state's cannabis market?
Yeah, the current state is pretty solid actually. As I mentioned earlier, the retail numbers were record setting so far year to date, and moreover were better than forecasted, which is quite remarkable because it's not like there's been a fundamental difference in the number of dispensaries or operators in the space. So what that tells me is that the disruption, while I'm sure frustrating for some, has not created the type of disruptions for the end consumer, and has not hurt the consumer perspective of what they're experiencing in the space. We had, I think, a poor communication issue, I would say, last week where we had published the timeline for implementation for the state, which included, and this was in November, and repeated it several times, But nevertheless, just because I'm saying it doesn't mean that people are hearing it. So, I mean, communication for what is being heard and understood really is our responsibility. And I definitely recognize that. But nevertheless, 228 was a deadline where products that could be transferred from distribution to final retail had to have gone through essentially the full process within Metrc to be considered a finished good. And there's actually an identification like checkbox, very simple, for an item to be a finished good. About half of the products that were at just all the various distribution facilities were still marked as unfinished goods, which meant that they could not be transferred. Now, there was still functionality and the ability for distributors to be able to flip that from unfinished to finished, probably just an area that, at least based on the feedback we've gotten, is just an oversight and not understanding that that was a requirement to transfer. But it caused some disruption come Monday and Tuesday when some of these products can't be transferred from distribution. And there was, I think, a number of claims, again, more misinformation, that somehow this disruption had to do with the retail ID functionality, which is entirely inaccurate. There's nothing with retail ID that can preclude a product from being shipped or being transferred from one license to another. If there's nothing programmatically in the system, but just logically zooming out, how would Metrc know that an item has a physical identifier on it or not? Until if they were generated, but even that doesn't stop a product from moving through the supply chain. But nevertheless, I had many calls last week to that effect, and that's just not the case. So I would say that was a more meaningful disruption, certainly a lesson learned, certainly an opportunity for us to be more proactive. We very easily could have partnered with the OCM the week before to reach out to some of the distributors and say, hey, looks like we've got a lot of products that are in your facility that are unfinished and you're not gonna be able to move next week. Need to address that. And so that's certainly something I would prefer that we've done better. And it's definitely an area that we've had a lot of discussions on internally.
And a lesson learned, something that won't happen again, I'm sure.
It won't happen, but it also can't happen again because
Well, in other jurisdictions.
in other jurisdictions, we've actually never had this issue. It's also a unique situation anytime you're implementing a system where there was no track and trace system in place, I mentioned before. So you have a lot of product. Usually when a new state sets up their track and trace regime, there are very few licensees. I don't think we had any licensed operators in Alabama for 2 years after implementing the system. Virginia, fairly small market, certainly growing rapidly. But when we implement the system, you're talking about less than 20 operators. So it's not, it's a lot easier. I mean, we could have a conference call with all 20 operators and walk them through in detail. New York's 3,000. It doesn't work like that. And so there's a lot more product that's in flow in the supply chain that you have to be a little bit more mindful of. So some of the lessons, as you alluded to with your earlier question, in some of the other states where we've learned a lot and grown a lot from, this is different. It is different. I am particularly proud of the ability to maintain and really enhance the overall outcome, certainly as evidenced by the sales. But that doesn't mean that we're perfect. It doesn't mean that we're doing a victory lap. There's a lot more work to do. I do feel fairly confident that that little hiccup that we experienced last week is something that's beyond us. And there's no other meaningful kind of show-stopping deadline. The vast majority of operators are using the system. Our support call volume is fairly low. In spite of the phone calls I've gotten for people with questions in retail ID, I have less than 66 total cases that were submitted to our support team over a 2-week period.
Oh, terrific. Anything else you'd like to add before we conclude, Michael?
No, it's just, I really appreciate you having me on. It's an honor to be able to partner with the state of New York. It's an honor to be able to work with the operators. I firmly believe that New York has the ability to have the most robust and successful market. I think you see a lot of optimism out of the OCM, new leadership there, creating the standards for which everybody is able to grow their business and really create a net positive for the citizens of New York is very special. We have a lot of excitement about it, and again, really honored to be able to be part of this story.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today, Michael Johnson, CEO of Metrc. Thank you.
Thank you.